She slept in a barn. Not because they were poor, not because there was no room, but because a grandmother decided, before she was even old enough to understand what rejection felt like, that she did not deserve the main house. She slept in a barn, and every morning she woke up, swept the compound of the main house, fetched water for the main house, and she did all of this without any breakfast in her stomach. Then she went on to prepare food for the woman who put her there. Every day, without being asked, without complaint, without a single morning where she let bitterness make the decision before her heart could. This panther has walked through many forests and heard many stories carried on the wind. But let her tell you the story of a girl whose goodness was so deep, so quiet, so unshakable that even the spirits of the old forest stopped to take notice. Her name was Chietachi, but her mother and everyone else called her Tachi. And this is where her story begins. There are some homes that tell you everything before anyone opens their mouth. This was one of them. The Chialotam compound sat at the edge of the village of Unewe, like a man who had once been proud and was still trying to remember why. The main house was large, clay walls freshly painted a faded white, a wide veranda where Grandmother Chioma held court every evening, a kitchen that smelled of palm oil and authority. Mango trees lined the front, planted by a grandfather nobody living had ever met, their roots old and deep and unbothered. And at the back of the compound, past the garden that had stopped being tended, past the firewood stack, past the place where the goats were kept at night, there was the barn. It had been converted. That was the word people used. Converted. As if a word that polite could cover what it really was. A decision. A statement made in silence that had never been taken back. 2 small rooms. A window with no glass, covered instead with a cloth that moved when the wind came through. A door that didn't lock properly. A floor of packed earth that Ngozi, Tachi's mother, had covered with woven mats so worn the patterns had faded into memory. This was their home. Ngozi had lived in it for the last 23 years. Tachi had lived in it for all 19 of hers. And across the compound, through the mango trees, behind the wide veranda, Grandmother Chioma's house stood and said nothing. Now, to understand Tachi, you must first understand Grandmother Chioma. And to understand Grandmother Chioma, you must go back. You must go back to a younger woman, a grief so enormous it needed a direction, and 2 daughters who grew up in the same house, but never in the same warmth. Grandmother Chioma had 2 daughters. Kamsi, the firstborn, was the one she loved the way rivers loved the sea, completely, naturally, as if there were no other direction to flow. Kamsi was radiant, laughing, the kind of girl who walked into a room and rearranged it simply by existing. And then there was Ngozi. Ngozi was quieter, steadier, the kind of girl who did not demand love but waited for it patiently, the way a seed waits for rain. She waited a long time. The rain came, but never quite the way it came for Kamsi. Both daughters grew up, both married, both became pregnant in the same season, that strange overlapping of lives that families sometimes experience as if the children chose to arrive together. But Kamsi did not survive the arrival. She died in childbirth. Her daughter, Nena, delivered into the world in the same breath that took her mother out of it. And Grandmother Chioma's grief, enormous, inconsolable, a wound that never fully closed, found its direction. It went toward Nena, everything soft, everything tender, every piece of love that had nowhere else to go. And it went away from Ngozi, not as a conscious decision. Grief rarely is, but there it was, the quiet daily punishment of a woman who survived when her sister had not. The accusation that lived in every glance, every cold shoulder, every meal served last, every door half closed. You are here She is not, and I cannot forgive you for it, the silence and coldness said daily. Ngozi never said this directly to Tachi, but Tachi grew up knowing it the way children know things they were never told. In the body, in the gut, in the specific way silence feels when it is pointed at you. She knew she was loved by her mother. She knew she was tolerated by her grandmother. She knew that across the compound, her cousin Nena woke up every morning inside a love that was never going to be hers. And she had made peace with it, or something that looked like peace from the outside. Nena was beautiful in the way that people who have never been told no are beautiful. Bright, expectant, carrying herself through the world as if it owed her a soft landing. She wore the best wrappers. She laughed the loudest at the veranda gatherings. She had never fetched water in her life because there had always been someone to fetch it for her. Usually, Tachi. The village knew. Villages always know. Women at the market would look at Tachi with that particular expression. Part pity, part admiration, part the uncomfortable guilt of people who see an injustice and say nothing because it is not happening in their compound. Old Mama Ezine, who sold garden eggs near the water pump, used to press extra tomatoes into Tachi's hands without explanation. Just pressed them in, held her fingers a moment too long, and looked away. That was the village's apology. Tomatoes and averted eyes. Tachi accepted them with a smile. Then, the day where it all unraveled came. It started as a cough. That was how Ngozi described it later. Just a cough, the kind old women get when the harmattan comes and the air turns dry and dusty. Nothing alarming, nothing that warranted attention. But this cough did not leave with the harmattan. It stayed. It deepened. It settled into Grandmother Chioma's chest like something that had decided to make a home there. And within 3 weeks, the woman who ruled her compound from that veranda every evening could no longer rise from her bed without help. The fever came next, then the weakness, then the long frightening nights when Ngozi would hear sounds from the main house and lie awake in the barn listening. Her feelings impossible to name, because what do you feel when the woman who has punished you for 20 years is suffering? What do you feel when your heart reaches toward her despite everything, and you cannot decide if that reaching is love or habit or something else entirely? Tachi did not have that confusion. She simply went. Every morning before her own breakfast, she was in the main house, boiling water, crushing leaves for steam, changing the cloth on Grandmother Chioma's forehead, sitting in the wooden chair beside the bed through the long afternoon hours, quiet and present, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes watching the old woman's chest rise and fall as if she could will it to keep moving by watching hard enough. Nena visited once. She stood in the doorway of Grandmother Chioma's room, her wrapper fresh, her headscarf tied beautifully, and looked at the scene before her, the sick bed, the medicines, the smell of illness that no amount of herbs could fully mask, with an expression that moved quickly from discomfort to something harder. She looked at Tachi in the chair, and something crossed her face. Of course she'd rush to help her, Nena said, her voice light, almost amused, directed at no one particular and everyone in the room. Then she turned and left. The room held those words for a long time after she had gone. Grandmother Chioma, drifting in and out of sleep, may or may not have heard them. Tachi sat with them settling into her skin, finding the places that were already tender, pressing in. Desperate to be chosen. She looked at her grandmother's sleeping face, the deep lines, the grey at the temples, the hands that had never once reached for her in comfort. She looked at her for a long time. Then she picked up the cloth, dipped it in cool water, wrung it carefully, and laid it across the old woman's forehead. She was not desperate to be chosen. She was simply choosing. If you have ever kept showing up for someone who never showed up for you, this panther sees you. Hit that like button. This story was carried through the forest for people like you. Hila Adaku arrived on a Thursday. She was not from Nweye. She came from 2 villages east, brought by a neighbor who had seen her work before and trusted it. She was a small woman with enormous presence, her bag made of old leather and stuffed with things that rustled when she walked, her eyes the kind that assessed everything in a single sweep and gave nothing back for free. She examined Grandmother Chioma for a long time. She pressed, she listened, she held the old woman's wrist and closed her eyes. She asked questions that Ngozi answered from the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, her voice careful. Then Hila Adaku came outside. "The sickness is in the chest and the blood both," she said, not unkindly, but without softening. "I can treat the chest, but the blood needs the root of the Ojo here, the forest kola. It grows past the second stream, in the deep forest. Brought fresh, prepared before evening, it will break the fever within a day." Ngozi's face changed. "The deep forest." "Past the second stream," Adaku confirmed. "I would go myself, but I must return to my village before nightfall. I have patients there." She looked between Ngozi and Tachi, who had come to stand beside her mother. "Someone young needs to go. Before tomorrow morning, the sickness will not wait." She left her instructions. She left her leather bag of treatments for the chest. She left the name of the root, described its leaf, described its smell, drew its shape in the dust with one finger, and then she was gone. The compound was very quiet. Ngozi turned to look at her daughter, and Tachi already knew what her mother's face was doing before she fully looked at it. "Tachi, I'll go. You will not." Ngozi's voice was low and final in the way that mothers' voices get when they are trying not to show fear. "People do not go into that forest alone, not past the second stream. You know the stories. The stories are old. Stories are old because they happened long enough ago that people forgot to be afraid of them. That is not the same as them being untrue." Tachi was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mama, she needs that root. She has never once..." Ngozi stopped herself, pressed her lips together, started again. "She has never treated you the way she should have. She put us in that barn, Tachi. She has watched you serve her every day of your life and never said thank you, not once. And now you want to go into the deep forest alone for her?" Ngozi's face changed. At the exhaustion in it, at the 23 years of it, at the love for her daughter that was currently fighting with 23 years of accumulated hurt, and she felt something move through her chest. Not pity, something gentler and more complicated than that. "I'm going for you," Tachi said quietly, "not for her, because she's your mother, and whatever she has done, I know what it would do to you to lose her." Ngozi's eyes filled. She turned away quickly. "Inena should go with you at least. You should not go alone." They found Nena getting ready. Her best wrapper was laid out on the bed. She was in front of the small mirror propped against her window, pressing her headscarf down with both palms, tilting her head to examine the result. The sounds of a celebration could be heard faintly from the direction of the Obi family compound down the road. Drums, women singing, a marriage rite that had been planned for weeks. Ngozi explained the situation. The healer, the root, the deep forest, the need for someone to accompany Tachi. Inena did not turn from the mirror immediately. She finished examining her headscarf, smoothed an eyebrow. Then she looked at her aunt's reflection and laughed, a short, incredulous sound, as if the request had genuinely surprised her with its unreasonableness. "Auntie Ngozi, you want me to go into the deep forest when Adaora's marriage rites are today?" She turned now, fully, gesturing at herself, the wrapper, the headscarf, the deliberate beauty of someone who had been preparing for hours. "Tachi can go. She's the one who loves doing things like this. The same light tone as before, the same casual blade. Besides, Grandma has lasted this long. She'll be fine." Ngozi stared at her niece for a long moment. Then she turned and walked out. Nena went back to her mirror. Tachi was already at the edge of the compound, her wrapper tied firmly, her mother's old basket on her arm, Hila Adaku's description memorized and carried in her mind like a map. Ngozi came and stood before her. She held her daughter's face in both hands, the way she had when Tachi was small, when the burn was new and the pain of it was still sharp enough to cut. She looked at her for a long time. "Come back before the sun touches the treetops," she said finally. "If you are not back by then, I am coming in after you." "I'll be back." Tachi, Ngozi's hands tightened slightly. "I mean it, before the sun touches the treetops." "Yes, Mama." Ngozi released her. Tachi walked towards the forest. "Tell this panther, if you were Tachi and had been made to live like a slave in your own family house, would you do something this selfless for the one who put you in that situation? I want to know. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your country in the comments. This story was carried from the old forest, and this panther wants to know how far the wind has taken it. Tachi reached the forest. It was not frightening in the way that stories made it. It did not roar, it did not darken suddenly or speak in human voices or rearrange its paths like a living maze. It was simply a forest, deep, old, indifferent to human schedules and human urgency, filled with the sounds of things that lived there permanently, watching the things that passed through. Tachi knew the first part of the path well. She had gathered firewood here, collected leaves for Grandmother Chioma's earlier preparations, followed the stream on its narrow bank. But past the second stream, there the trees grew taller and closer together. The light came in at strange angles, and the sounds changed quality, less familiar, more considered. Tachi found the audio here, in a patch of ground where two large trees had fallen and left a gap in the canopy, just as described. The leaves wide and dark, the smell, when she crushed one between her fingers, something between bitter and clean. She walked carefully and quickly, filling the basket, checking each root against Adaku's description. The sun was still high enough. She had time. She was turning to leave when she heard it. A sound that did not belong to the forest. A human sound, small and strained, coming from somewhere deeper in, somewhere past the direction she needed. Tachi stood still, listened. Again, a voice, old, female, not distressed exactly, but the voice of someone who had been trying to stay calm for longer than calm was comfortable. She should leave. Her basket was full. Her mother's deadline sat in the back of her mind like a hand on her shoulder. The sun was still manageable, but forest time moved differently than compound time. She went towards the sound anyway. The old woman was sitting on a fallen log in a small clearing that the path did not go through. She was slight, the kind of thinness that comes from many years rather than from not eating. Her wrapper faded to a color that was once deep red and now something softer. Her headscarf had come partially undone. She sat very straight despite her obvious exhaustion, her hands folded on her knees, and she was looking at the trees around her with the careful, assessing expression of someone who had been looking at them for some time and come to accept that none of them were going to help. She looked up when Tachi entered the clearing. "Nwami," she said, "my child." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were tired. "I have been sitting here since this morning trying to remember which direction the stream is." Tachi looked around the clearing. She looked at the angle of the light coming through the canopy. She looked at the direction of the very faint sound of water, not the second stream, but a tributary farther east. "How did you come in?" Tachi asked. The old woman gestured vaguely behind her. "From the path near the yam farms. I was looking for uziza leaves. I know this forest." She paused, a small admission of a larger truth. "I knew this forest many years ago." Tachi set her basket down, not to leave it, but to set it on the ground more comfortably. then picked it up again, adjusting the handle to her other hand. The herbs were not so heavy she couldn't manage them, and something else. "I'm going out past the first stream," she said. "The path to the Chielotam farms comes out near there. I'll take you." The old woman looked at Tachi's basket, at the direction Tachi had been walking before she heard her, at the sky. "You were leaving?" "I was," Tachi agreed. "Come, Mama. Let's go before the light changes." They walked slowly. The old woman moved with a careful deliberateness, not frail, but precise, placing each foot with the attention of someone who had learned that the ground could not always be trusted. Tachi walked beside her, the basket in one hand, her other hand available but not insisting, offered and waiting. The forest did not cooperate. The path that Tachi had been setting off for 20 minutes began to feel uncertain. The tributary sound seemed to shift direction, or perhaps the trees were simply closer here, bending sound the way they bent light. She chose left at a fork she did not remember forking. The light changed quality. 20 minutes later, she knew. She was not lost in the dramatic way of stories, not spinning, not panicking. She was simply in a part of the forest she did not recognize, with a sun that was moving at its own unbothered pace, and a deadline that was not. "We've gone the wrong way," she said. The old woman said nothing, just looked at her. "I'm going to find the stream," Tachi continued, keeping her voice even. "Okay? Don't worry, don't panic. If I find water, I can find the direction." She was not going to show fear in front of an old woman who had been sitting alone in this forest since morning. One of them needed to be steady. She found a resting place, a flat stone near a thick tree, and helped the old woman sit. Then she walked in careful expanding circles, listening. The insects were thicker here, the small biting kind that found the back of the neck and the inner arms with infuriating accuracy. She felt the first one, then the second, then stopped tracking them because there was no point. There, the sound of water, faint but consistent. She went back for the old woman. They found the stream. They followed it. The forest gave them the path back the way forests sometimes do. Not generously, but eventually, as if deciding that the game had gone on long enough. The trees thinned, the light broadened, the sounds of the open world, a distant voice, the specific quality of wind that has no canopy above it, came filtering through. And then they were out. The old woman's cottage was not far. A small structure at the edge of the forest tree line, almost invisible against the undergrowth until you were nearly upon it. A cooking fire outside, long cold. A clay pot overturned on a stone. The particular look of a place lived in alone for a long time. Tachi walked her to the door. Her arms had insect bites from wrist to elbow. Her wrapper had a tear from a branch she had not seen in the darker section. The sun was significantly lower than she had intended it to be when she left. The old woman stopped at her door and turned. For a moment, she simply looked at Tachi with the kind of attention that has nothing casual in it. Not gratitude exactly, something more serious than gratitude. The look of someone taking a full account. "You did not leave your things," the old woman observed. "They weren't too heavy. You did not complain, not once, not about the direction, not about the insects, not about the time." Tachi almost said what would be the point of complaining. Instead, she said nothing. "What is your name?" "My name is Tachi, but everyone calls me Tachi." The old woman nodded slowly. "Tachi," she said it as if she was setting it somewhere safe. "And what is it that you want, Tachi? If you could ask for anything from this world or the world beneath it, what is it that your heart truly carries?" Tachi chuckled. "Really?" The old woman nodded once, her face serious. The question settled without ceremony. No light from the sky, no change in the old woman's appearance, no drums, just an old woman at her cottage door asking a young woman with insect bites on her arms what she truly wanted. And something about the ordinariness of it made Tachi go completely still. She looked at the woman, at the steady ancient quality in her eyes, at the way the question had landed, not like conversation, but like something else, something that required a different quality of answer. She thought about the barn. She thought about Nena's voice, always desperate to be chosen. She thought about her mother's face holding hers this morning, the fear in it and the love in it and the exhaustion that lived behind both. She thought about the chair beside Grandmother Chioma's sickbed, about the forehead cloth, about 19 years of a cold compound and a cold silence and meals served last. She could ask to leave, to take her mother somewhere new, somewhere that had never heard the name Chielotam, somewhere the barn was just a barn and had nothing to do with them. She could ask for the kind of life that would make Nena's mouth close and stay closed, the kind that would make the village women stop pressing tomatoes into her hands with guilty eyes. She could ask for so many things. Her heart moved through all of them, touched each one, set each one down, and found at the very bottom the thing that had been there the whole time. "My grandmother is sick," Tachi said. Her voice was quiet and certain. "The healer says she may not recover without help. I want her to be well." She paused. "Not for herself, for my mother. My mother has carried too much grief already. I don't want her to carry this one too." The old woman was very still. "Your grandmother has not been kind to you." Tachi paused. How could this woman know? But when she thought of how almost the entire village knew but averted their eyes, she let it go. She shook her head once. "No, she has not." "Or your mother?" "No." And still, Tachi agreed, simply, without decoration. "That would be what I want if I could choose." If this story has ever reached the place inside you where you keep the things you do for people who don't deserve it, share it. Share it right now with someone who needs to hear that their goodness is not weakness. This panther will wait. The old woman looked at her for a long moment. Then she said quietly, with a weight that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the conversation, "Go home, Tachi. Go home quickly." She went inside and closed her door. The path home was clear now, as if the forest had stopped playing games. Tachi walked fast. The sun was at the treetops, her mother's deadline come and almost gone. She pushed past the familiar markers, past the firewood trees, past the place where the path widened, and then she was out of the forest completely, and the compound was ahead of her, and she was running the last stretch without deciding to run. The main house door was open. She stopped at the threshold, breathing hard, basket in hand, and looked in. Her mother was sitting in the wooden chair beside Grandmother Chioma's bed. Not the anxious sitting of earlier, the sitting of someone who had arrived at a particular stillness. One hand rested on the edge of the sleeping mat, her head tilted slightly, watching. Grandmother Chioma was asleep, but she was breathing differently. The labored, effortful breathing of the sick, the sound that had filled this room for weeks, was gone. What replaced it was something ordinary, something that sounded like simply sleeping. Ngozi looked up when Tachi appeared. Something moved across her mother's face that Tachi could not immediately read. "Come," Ngozi said softly. Tachi set her basket carefully at the doorway and came. Her mother told her quietly, in the low voice people use in rooms where someone is sleeping, what had happened. Around the time the sun began to descend, Ngozi had been sitting in this same chair, preparing herself for the long night, listening to her mother's difficult breathing. Something changed. The fever did not break gradually. It broke the way a storm breaks, completely, quickly, and then it was simply gone. Grandmother Chioma had opened her eyes. She had looked at the ceiling. Then she had looked at Ngozi in the chair beside her with an expression Ngozi did not have a word for, and said, in a voice that was weak but clear, "I'm hungry." Ngozi stared at her. "Go and bring me food, Nwam, my child," said to Ngozi, who had not been called that in so many years she had stopped counting. Ngozi had brought food. Her mother had eaten a small amount, not much, but deliberately. Then she had asked for water to bathe herself, had done so slowly with Ngozi's help, without once complaining about weakness or pain, and had returned to the sleeping mat and gone back to sleep. That was 20 minutes ago. Tachi listened to all of this. Then she told her mother what had happened in the forest. The old woman on the log, the wrong path, the insects, the cottage, the question, and the wish. But I didn't think it was anything. She was just a normal old woman. Ngozi was silent for a long time when Tachi finished. She looked at her daughter, at the insect bites on her arms, the torn wrapper, the herbs still in the basket at the door, the face of this 19-year-old girl who had gone into the deep forest alone and been offered anything and had asked for this. She looked at all of it, and she pressed her lips together very hard. "You could have wished for anything," Ngozi said. Her voice came out unsteady. "I know. Ngozi, that woman put us in a ban. I know, Mama. You could have wished for us to leave, to have our own home, to have..." "Mama," Tachi took her mother's hand, held it the way her mother had held her face this morning. "You would have grieved her. I know you. You would have grieved her and pretended you weren't, and it would have lived in you the way things live in you. I didn't want that for you." And after a pause, Tachi said the last part out. "And we both know it wouldn't have been the right thing to do. She may have hurt us, but we are still family. Our joy would have been incomplete if we left Mama behind to suffer alone." Ngozi's eyes were bright. She turned her face toward the window. She said finally, when she trusted her voice again, "You must have met a spirit, the Moor of the old forest. They say she has not been seen in many years." She shook her head slowly. "A spirit, Tachi." She asked what my heart truly carried. That was the answer my heart gave. They sat together in the quiet room. The old woman between them breathed in and out, ordinary and steady, and alive. Then finally, Ngozi nodded. "All right, my daughter. Perhaps you are right. Perhaps you have a heart much bigger than mine, and perhaps that is the most blessing we need in our lives." Grandmother Chioma did not recover dramatically. She recovered the way old things heal, slowly, crookedly, with an awareness of every step that had not been there before. The healer returned 3 days later, found her sitting up, found her breathing clear, stood at the bedside for a long moment without speaking, then said only, "Finish the herbs anyway," and left without further explanation. Nena returned from the marriage rite celebration bright and cheerful and full of stories about the dancing. She stood in Grandmother Chioma's doorway and declared it wonderful that her grandmother was feeling better, kissed her grandmother's cheek, and went to sit on the veranda. Taki served the evening meal. Grandmother Chioma watched her move around the room. She had been watching Tachi the way she had not watched her before, with a new quality of attention, as if she was seeing a face she recognized from somewhere she could not immediately place, as if she were looking at something she had been looking at for years without ever actually seeing it. She said nothing the first evening, or the second. On the third evening, when Tachi brought her night herbs and set them on the small table beside the sleeping mat, Grandmother Chioma's hand came out and rested on Tachi's wrist. Slowly, not gripping, not demanding, just resting. Tachi got still. The old woman did not look at her, she looked at the wall, like she didn't know her hand had moved, but the hand stayed on Tachi's. After a moment, she said in a voice that had something raw moving underneath it, "The barn needs a proper window." Tachi said nothing. "Before the next Hamatan," Grandmother Chioma said, "it needs a proper window, and the door," she paused, "the door doesn't close correctly." Her hand moved back. "Drink your herbs before they go cold," Tachi said, and left the room. She stood outside the main house in the compound, in the dark, and let herself feel it. Not the big feeling, not the version of this moment that speeches are made from. The small, complicated, honest version, the one that had no clean name. Something between relief and grief and the specific ache of a door that has been closed so long you had stopped believing it could open, and now it has moved. Not swung wide, just moved, slightly, an inch, and you don't know yet if you trust it enough to walk toward it. She stood there for a while. Then she walked across the compound to the barn, and she lay down on her mat and she looked up at the ceiling that had been her sky for 19 years. Her mother was already asleep beside her, breathing deeply, her face in sleep losing 10 years of its exhaustion. Tachi listened to the compound, to the night sounds of Newi, to the very faint sound of her grandmother's breath from across the yard. She thought about the old woman's cottage, about the way she said, "Go home quickly." Not "thank you," not "you have done well," just "go home." As if she already knew what Tachi would find when she got there. What is it that your heart truly carries? This panther wants to ask you the same question tonight. Not what you wish you wanted, not what you think you should want. What does your heart truly carry when everything else is set aside? Leave it in the comments. I will read every single one of them. The window was fixed before the Hamatan. A carpenter arrived one morning, hired by whom Tachi did not ask and was not told, but the money was from the main house savings, and this was known because Grandmother Chioma mentioned it to Ngozi over breakfast in a tone that allowed no discussion. The door was fixed too, and the packed earth floor, Ngozi had covered it with mats for 19 years and never complained, was cemented over on a dry Tuesday while they sat on the outside bench and watched, Ngozi with her arms folded and her jaw set and her eyes doing something she would not explain. They were small things, not enough to erase 23 years, not offered as erasure, and this was perhaps what made them bearable rather than insulting. There was no speech, no formal apology delivered from a veranda, no moment where Grandmother Chioma gathered the compound and declared herself reformed. There was a window, there was a door that closed, there was a floor that no longer breathed cold at night. And there was an evening, maybe 2 weeks into the recovery, when Grandmother Chioma had graduated from the sickbed to the veranda chair, when the color had begun to return to her face and her voice had found most of its old authority, when she called to Tachi as she passed. "Come. Sit." Tachi sat on the veranda step. They did not speak immediately. They watched the compound in the evening light, the mango trees, the goats, the specific orange the sky turned over the village at that hour. Then Grandmother Chioma said without looking at her, "You are like your mother." Tachi waited. "Your mother was always the steady one," the old woman said. Something moved in her voice that Tachi had never heard there before. "I was not fair to her. I was not..." She stopped, started differently. "Kamsi was my heart. When she died, I did not know where to put the pieces. I put them wrong." The compound held the words. "I know," Tachi said. "I should have..." "I know," Tachi said again, gently, not cutting her off, closing the door on the version of this conversation that required Tachi to reassure the woman who had hurt her. She was not going to do that. But she was going to sit here, on this veranda, in the evening light, and let the door open its 1 inch. That was enough for now. The village women who saw them there, sitting together in the evening, Grandmother Chioma in her chair, Tachi on the step, the compound quiet around them, would talk about it. Of course they would. Villages always talk. But this time, what they said was different from what they had said before. This time, what they said was, "Did you see?" And the way they said it carried something that sounded, finally, like the right kind of awe. Nena saw it too. And Nena, who had been raised on certainty, the certainty of being chosen, of being loved first, of the compound arranging itself around her needs, found that certainty wobbling in a way it never had before. Because the grandmother she had left to die with a laugh and a light remark was now sitting on the veranda in the evenings with the barn girl, and the barn girl was not gloating, and that somehow made it worse. She said nothing. For once, Nena said nothing. The light tone had gone somewhere. In its absence was something she did not yet have a name for. This panther knows what it was, and you know too. Leave it in the comments. One word for what Nena felt when she saw that kindness had outlasted cruelty in the compound she grew up in. Tachi did not become a different person because a spirit heard her wish. She was already the person she needed to be. She had been that person in the barn, at the sick bed, on the forest path with insects on her arms and an old woman's weight against her side. The wish did not create her character. It revealed it to the forest, to the spirit, to her grandmother, and most importantly, to herself. This is what this panther wants you to carry out of this story tonight. Goodness is not weakness. It is not desperation. It is not what Nena said it was, the action of someone who has not yet learned to protect themselves. Goodness is the most radical choice available to a person who has every reason to be bitter and chooses otherwise. Not because it always gets rewarded, not because the grandmother always fixes the window, not because the compound always rearranges itself in your favor, but because bitterness is a weight that the bitter one carries alone. And some people, the rare ones, the ones the forest watches for, decide not to pick it up. Tachi slept in a barn. She fetched water for a woman who would not look at her. She walked into the deep forest with insect bites and a deadline and a good heart, and she came out the same person she went in. And something in the old forest, something that had been waiting, saw her. If this story sat somewhere true in your chest tonight, this panther asks one thing: share it. Share it with someone who is carrying a weight that nobody sees. Someone who keeps showing up for people who haven't shown up for them. Tell them that something greater is watching. And until the next story comes through your screen, keep your heart soft, keep your hands open, and never let anyone mistake your gentleness for desperation. This panther knows the difference, even if the rest of the crowd does not.